Isophyta, also called golden algae, have green pigments for photosynthesis called chlorophyll A and C, and some xanthophylls that are called fucoxanthins, in almost maybe equal proportion and sometimes even more golden yellows than the greens. As such, these are some of the more delightful types of algae to look at because they do have varying shades of golden colors. So we often call these the golden algae. We find freshwater and marine species, or in other words, saltwater and freshwater. And since most of them are single-celled, they might live together in colonies, but frequently they're found as individual unicellular organisms. If we find them in large bodies of water, serving as the foundation of the food chain, we often use the general term plankton to describe these tiny single-celled organisms that would include the golden algae. Another general name that's given to the golden algae are diatoms. Diatoms, or the golden algae, have a very different kind of cell wall material when compared to the green algae. The shell structure for golden algae are typically made of silica, or they're very glass-like. It's a form of what we call biomineralization, where the silica is extracted from the water by the little organism and is used to make a nice little outer covering with plenty of holes large enough to allow water and nutrients to be brought into the cell, and then waste products and other excreted products to be released outside of the cell. Now notice on some of these photographs, especially in the middle photo, where there's sort of a roundish looking golden alga, it's called Stephanodiscus. Stephanodiscus is essentially very much like a petri dish. It has a top and a bottom, and they overlap. You can just barely make out the sort of the middle line on the scanning electron micrograph of the upper right-hand picture, where you can see where the top and the bottom of the shell of Stephanodiscus are sort of placed together or stacked together. What you can see in the middle picture that has the golden color is the single-celled organism, and the little tiny football structures that are essentially where the color is located are the chloroplasts inside this single-celled organism. The other type of diatom that's in this photo is Asterianella. Asterianella has long, slender cell structures that function and live together as a colony that looks very much like a star. When these little organisms die and their shells remain, because the essentially silica-based material that's used for the shell doesn't dissolve very quickly. And as the little shells pile up one layer after another, then we can go out with different kinds of digging devices, dig up that very soft cleaning material, and use this particular paste of diatoms as an industrial polish. If you've ever seen the old-fashioned silver polish that maybe your great-grandmother might have used, came in a jar, looked a little bit kind of gray-looking, actually kind of smelled fairly good, and it was an excellent silver polish. Well, those were all the accumulated shells of diatoms that were packaged in the container and sent to Grandma so she could clean her silverware. A few more examples of diatoms can be found in the genus Navicula. Now, when you think of the word navy, I hope you all think of boats or ships. Boats or any kind of device where you would float on the water to transport materials or animals or people. Well, that's kind of where we get the word navy, and that's part of the root word for these diatoms because they are boat-shaped. If you look fairly closely at some of the middle pictures, you can see the individual cells that are inside of their glass or silica covering. And the colored material would be, of course, the location of the chloroplasts that are the light-catching materials where photosynthesis occurs. There are two species that are given as examples on this slide. Navicula eastwoodi, which is a very sort of pointy, very slender-looking boat-shaped structure, and Navicula subspectabulus, which is a little bit wider than its length. One of the very popular groups of algae, the Phaeophyta, also called brown algae, are fairly large and found in marine habitats. They also use chlorophylls A and C and the xanthophylls that we call fucoxanthins. But unlike the goldens, these brown algae have a lot more of the green pigments, and in fact, very intense, dark, sort of olive drab or olive brown colors are typically what we would see in the brown algae. Now, if you look at the little photo on the right, those are not plants. Those are brown algae growing on the coastline of essentially the ocean shore. They're called sea palms, Palms, and the sea palms, they're really not palm trees, but they kind of look a little bit like a tiny little miniature palm tree, even though it's really a brown algae. Some of the massive growths of brown algae out in the ocean are so large we can actually see them from satellite images. They actually grow in very massive collections that we call kelp. We even see kelp forests, large, long structures. They often grow almost 3 feet or a meter in length every day. They grow to these lengths annually. So every year we have new growths of kelp forests. And there are 2 genera of brown algae, Nereocystis and Laminaria, that are common representatives of the brown algae in the form of kelp. If you notice in the illustrations on the right, in the Atlantic Ocean, there are massive kelp forests that typically show up off the east coast of the United States in and around Bermuda. We call it the Sargasso Sea. The Sargasso Sea, in centuries prior to modern day, were often so densely packed with kelp forests, it was difficult sometimes for explorers and navigators and sailors to sail their ships through these densely packed kelp forests. Now, the brown algae in the form of kelp are very necessary for the health and the continued growth of all kinds of organisms out in the ocean. There are lots of little fish and little animals that live in the ocean that depend on these kelp forests for a place to hide and a place to grow and reproduce. So they're important components of the natural cycle of things in the ocean. Here we have some more specific examples of kelp and sea palms, so you can get a close-up image. Notice in the drawing in the middle, we have the description of terms and images of the different pieces and parts we'd expect to find in a kelp. we start at the top, where we might see air-filled bladders. These air-filled bladders do look like little basketballs or little round spheres that have air in them that allow and assist this large structure to float in the water column. We're going to find what look like leaves, but in fact we call them blades. Those are the large, flat extensions that are used to capture sunlight energy. Instead of a stalk or a stem, that long sort of filamentous structure that the blades emerge from is called a stipe. And at the very bottom, we don't have roots. We have something called a holdfast. That are little extensions that allow the brown algae to grab onto the sediment or rocky surface at the bottom and have a place to attach and stay essentially in the collection of the rest of the brown algae that they're growing with. Now again, these look like they should be plants, but when we take a close look, they are multicellular, but there are no complex tissues or organs. They're just not there. The image of the sea palm on the right, upper right, you can see that it's maybe a little bit more green in color in this photo, but again we have blades at the top, we have a stipe that's fairly sturdy looking, and you can just make out the holdfast at the bottom that helps to secure this brown algae to the rocky shores along the ocean's coastline.